At one point in our lives, everyone had some kind of connection with reality as it is without any filtration. It was likely when we were really young. Something comes along and it causes pain, usually an emotional variety. And that's usually where ego kicks in because it's this protection mechanism. And that statement, that first wound that we spoke of, that tends to be established there and somehow gets reaffirmed. It's one of those things where you know how pseudoscience works, where they come up with a conclusion and then they look for evidence to support that conclusion and they find it. They find a lot of it. But that's the reason the scientific method doesn't function that way, because you're always going to find what you're looking for. And this is the essence of the identity itself. If you're a hammer, everything becomes a nail. And so if the identity has a belief in place, that's all it's going to be looking for out here. It's working in a pseudoscience kind of fashion, right? And if it can't find evidence out here, what it will do is it'll turn it in here. It'll say this sensation, this is what that means. And it's primarily, the primary function of that is a self-worth programming. It's a lacking. All intense ambition and desire have some sense of, I'm not good enough to have this yet. There's this yet. Yet I think a lot of people that are on this path have lived enough life where they've realized that it's like chasing their tail. That if, okay, I finally got to this thing that I knew that was going to make me happy. I got that little dose of happiness and that bar immediately moved up. It's like it can never be achieved as the sensation. And that's just because the program itself is saying you lack. You will never be whole, essentially. If that belief is present, then that will be the sensation that kind of pervades everything. And so it primarily is lacking. Think about the majority of the things we do is to prove our worth or somehow assert that we have some kind of worth. Ultimately, though, when you realize it's that this internal world, this is pointing really directly, this internal world doesn't actually exist. The reason it's saying I'm apart from all these other things is because it's saying that you lack. The reason behind that, who knows? Who knows why? But I do think there's a hero's journey involved. There's some kind of magical story that gets to take place and that sometimes transcends itself into some kind of legend or myth eventually. And I think the reason for that is because we're designed as social creatures, and being able to share, hey, this is what I went through to get here. Somebody else out there is going to hear that and be like, oh, that sounds really familiar. And we start to see a lot of interconnectivity between all of us. There seems to be this concept, as is above, so is below. One of the things I like to ask is, if you fertilize your tree, where do you put the fertilizer? And it turns out you put it right where the branches reach their maximum extent all around that tree. And that's because the roots below that tree are mirroring what's happening above. It's just like the nature of this universe. These paradoxes play themselves out quite a bit, right? We have in a dual world this light side, this dark side, this good, this bad, this pleasure, this pain. Yet I think if we allow ourselves to get honest, we will notice that the gray areas that seem to be between those things are actually telling us something more. These things are not separate, they're connected. And you can just go right back to what we think the origin seems to be. There was nothing, there was a huge bang, and now there was everything. Nothingness, everythingness must have some connection. They must be connected. And that's how the universe seems to play itself out in these paradoxes. And so the mind, then for some reason, it's like an experiment of nature, evolved to seek patterns. In order to find patterns, though, confirmation bias must reign supreme. And I think a lot of times what people will do, even inadvertently, is reject results that do not fit the frame. So to help people get to a place of saying, okay, why isn't it always working out for you this way when the formula seems to be in place? We can treat it like a game. Sometimes lowering the stakes can be really useful. Treat life like a game where you're running experiments. So you don't have to do the big things to test your confirmation bias, but you can start looking at things in a little bit of a different way, seeing if there's more to the story. And as that begins to widen, it builds courage. It builds a sense of self-trust that allows us to test that everywhere we go. And then what we see is there's way more to this story than we've allowed ourselves to see. It's so much more here. The filter has been reigning supreme this entire time. And now I have the opportunity to see what's really here. And it's a great way to do it. You can, speaking to each person, you'll find that there's certain things that they have that are pretty intense patterning. Like every Friday, I do this particular activity, and I've identified that drinking on Fridays has been screwing with my sleep, and I don't really like it. And as a micro test, I would introduce, okay, if you're going to go drinking, every other drink, make it a glass of water. Small thing. And I'm not saying completely push one thing away to go to another extreme, because the pendulum seems to want to swing. Instead, just see what else you can do. Just tiny little things will start to expand that experience. Yeah, I love that. I love And there's also this element of doing. I think one of the strongest beliefs that human beings have is that my worth can only be measured by doing. And it becomes really subconscious for people, and that becomes an intense driver for them a lot. And so even when they have time for rest and stillness, doing must be taking place. Yet if we pay attention to doing, right, it's okay. It's okay. And that's another thing, is one of the things I always let people know is wherever you are, that's okay. You're okay. And there's always an opportunity for something more. Stillness can be extremely excruciating for people because it stirs up feelings, sensations that have always been there, and you have to pay more attention. Yeah. And here's an idea of, along those lines, sitting with being uncomfortable about not being productive is all that needs to happen. There doesn't need to be another doing associated with that. There seems to be this dual sense of, I'm doing this and now I got to do something away from that. And it's just nonstop doing. Actual stillness is sometimes, now I'm resisting the thought. Okay, sit with the resistance. Be all that resistance of the thought. Don't do anything against the resistance. It becomes like a meta experience. I resist resistance, which resists more resistance, et cetera, et cetera. Judgments work that way too. You'll see that judgments that happen in this seemingly external world are always turned in, that they're self-judgments ultimately. And then what people will do is they'll recognize a judgment, they'll judge themselves for having that judgment, which makes them judge themselves for having that judgment, and it's a meta experience again. So when I say be with the resistance, be with the judgment, I'm saying sit with that sensation that you don't like. Absolutely. It could feel really amorphous and almost nexus. It's just a frame that doing will help quell any kind of pain. And that simple stillness, it doesn't even have to be meditative. In fact, sometimes I'll encourage people to sit still with eyes wide open and just pay attention. Pay attention to what the mind is doing. Is it telling you to, oh shit, I gotta do my taxes or whatever? Those things are important because all you really have to do is recognize it. Doop. Thought, what am I feeling about this? And you'll see that sensations in the body are always there. They just seem to intensify based upon thoughts and judgments, or go away because we're really good at learning how to distract ourselves from whatever we're being present with actually.